So that's how they know. So that's what racial profiling is about. It's not acceptable. The courts have said no. In the federal court, it's completely different. The fact that you're Muslim is the case against you.
Wow.
The fact that you support, that you practice your religion, the fact that you may be a traditionalist in terms of your view on religion, and traditionalist Muslims are not terrorists just because they are what you call like Orthodox Muslims. It doesn't mean they're terrorists. But that is the primary factor that leads to the courts upholding the security certificates against these people. You put it together with the fact, like, I'll give you an example. Travels. The person traveled to Pakistan, to Yemen. Well, terrorists go to Pakistan and Yemen. Therefore, the person's a Muslim, they travel to Pakistan and Yemen, they must be a terrorist. That's how it works, and the courts have approved it. And in fact, in 2005, when we were trying to get our clients out of detention, they probably served the longest period of time of anybody who's never been convicted in Canada. 7, 8 years, some of them, with no criminal charges against them. They were in detention because of the fear of terrorism. But when we were I think there were like 4 of them out before the courts that summer to try and get them out. I'm going to finish on this, try and get them out of jail. CSIS published a security threat to the government. They're allowed to do that, the security service. So they published this threat advising the government of the enhanced threat. And what they said is, if you're an Islamist and you've been detained, the longer you've been detained, don't believe that if a person's been detained for a long time, they may change their political views. They will never change because they're Islamists. In other words, Islamists are automatons, robots. They have no ability to think. They will always be the same. They will be static. And therefore, the threat is always present. We can leave them in jail for 100 years. That's what they're doing in Guantanamo. And they will always present a threat. And the court bought it. Not just one judge, 5 of them. So it's a problem. Thank you.
Well, one of the points I always used to make is that the witch hunters stand behind the flag of patriotism. I just found some exceptions to that. I like to stand behind certain flags myself. With all that, you missed my opening joke. Okay.
He doesn't think the view's improved.
Revolutionaries don't take attacks on civil liberties lightly. They are fundamental gains from the revolutionary struggles of working people the world over. The ruling class never handed anyone its civil liberties, its right to speak, its right to vote, its right to organize. And in fact, in virtually every case when these fundamental rights were exercised by working people against repressive governments, they were met with repression. And various justifications were used over the ages. The divine right of kings, national security, the communist threat, and today the threat is terrorism. It's the new anti-communism. It's the context that we evaluate many of the attacks on civil liberties. And behind the attacks on civil liberties and the false charge of aiding and abetting terrorism is an economic crisis that threatens the stability of the world capitalist system itself. The ruling class is smarter than you think, even though it has morons running for president, like George Bush. It also has the capacity to run intelligent men for president who do worse than Bush, with a smile. Let me give you some examples of the attacks on civil liberties today in the United States, very similar to the ones that you presented. There are approximately 8 million Muslims in the United States. The government has investigated 600,000 of them. Knock on the door from the FBI, visits at their home, forcing them to get attorneys, creating fear, and justifying the idea that all Muslims are terrorists. promoting racist ideas and racist language, towel heads, shootings of Muslims, attacks on mosques. And just last week, 4 Muslims were prevented from flying on an American Airlines flight. 4 of them were imams. 1 of them was a supporter of our United National Anti-War Committee, UNAC, and had spoken, I believe, at our demonstration. They were on their way to an anti-Islamophobic conference, and because they were Muslims, no other charges against them, they were prevented by American Airlines from flying. Terrorist threat was used to invade Iraq. That was the formal threat. And from the beginning of the first Persian Gulf War to the end, and the end is not in sight, they've killed 1.5 million Iraqis. They now admit that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, but it was a convenient tool to send troops to do what the United States really wanted to do. And the truth of what they wanted to do was documented by the former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who pointed out in his recent book that the real reason for the Iraq war was America's need for oil. That's the truth, and everybody knew it, but they couldn't say it. So they needed a justification that they were fighting terrorism or looking for weapons of mass destruction. And as ridiculous as everyone knows that is, no proof to this day, they justify the war and the murder of 1.5 million people ongoing in the grounds of bringing democracy to the Iranians, to the Iraqis. Their view is that the more you kill, the more democracy we're going to have. Imperialism needs an ideological justification for what it does. It imprisoned without any charges Japanese people because they were Japanese and we were at war with Japan. A friend of mine was the attorney who fought the case that won reparations for the Japanese after most all of them were dead. Today, to our amazement, the FBI raided the homes and gave grand jury subpoenas to 23 radicals and social activists who were engaged in solidarity work with the people of Palestine and Colombia. They refused to attend the grand jury hearings, and they rejected this McCarthy-era-like attack on them. And we came to their defense. We were the first, United National Anti-War Committee and Socialist Action, which plays a leading role in it. We organized demonstrations in 41 cities at federal buildings, because if we can't defend our own, and the activists who were subpoenaed, we didn't agree with them politically. They were members of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. We're members of Socialist Action. As you all know, we have big differences, which I will now spend 4 hours telling you about. I've just finished that explanation. We didn't care what their views were. They were part of our movement. They were part of our United National Anti-War Committee, and if we can't defend the victims of the government repression, we can't defend ourselves. An injury to one is still an injury to all. Just a few days ago, an email came out describing one of the FBI raids. The FBI in this particular case was told, the agents were told in advance that these people were armed and dangerous. And that and danger was put up there, and that they had a whole series of interrogation questions written out in advance of what they were going to ask them as they broke into their house. So with automatic weapons, they broke down the doors, smashed down the doors, sat the people down, and took every single book and piece of paper that they had. Tons of literature, with a subpoena pre-signed by federal judges. And this was repeated in some 23 instances. But they made a mistake, those stupid morons. They left behind the papers granted them as to what they were going to do, that is the secret orders in the file cabinet they had emptied. And of course, what this shows is that the FBI agents who know nothing were told that they were going to attack people who were armed. And that's why they came armed with automatic weapons. They treated them like the thugs that they are, and in the same manner that the United States treats the people of the world when it has some poor slob sitting in Nevada looking at a satellite television screen, dropping with drone missiles bombs into the homes of people who mercenaries like the Blackwater organization have designated enemies of the United States or suspected enemies. The same logic. They say we are withdrawing from Iraq, but we have more mercenaries in the Iraq war than in any war in the history of the United States, and now it is a majority of the armed forces in that country. So we have no truck with FBI investigations, and we don't care what political persuasion the victim is. They are all ours in the defense of everyone's civil liberties. Then there was WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Rarely a month passes that there isn't an article in the New York Times that has to, in small print buried somewhere, credit WikiLeaks for the information about the United States government. And this, of course, has to be laundered, because before the New York Times will print anything, it has to submit its articles and information from WikiLeaks to the White House for clearance and whitewashing. So much for freedom of the corporate press. There is none. All of the corporate press is a mouthpiece for imperialism in the same way that you described that the judges in the judicial system is the judicial arm of the ruling class of America. Julian Assange had, I can't remember the number, 280,000 cables from, you know who I'm talking about, right? Yeah. From the diplomatic embassies of the United States all over the world. And it is, if you read the stuff, it's shocking what they said. Each one of these politicians who wears a three-piece suit and is very dignified ambassador of our nation used the most vile language against anyone that the United States disagrees with, and uses any and all methods to advance the interests of the American corporate elite. And then they find a poor kid named Bradley Manning, what a beautiful face, who they charge with releasing this information, and they torture him without any charges. And they subject him to the most horrible prison treatment, so much so that the government was embarrassed around the world. And now they're seeking to suddenly find that Julian Assange was a rapist in Australia in order to discredit him. Latinos and blacks are victims like you would not believe today in the United States. 400,000 Latinos were arrested and imprisoned and deported last year by the ICE, Immigration Control Services, ICE, Immigration Control Services. 400,000 people, supposedly because they are illegal in the United States. But the ruling class wants them here to serve as cheap labor, undermine and lower the cost, the average wage of all workers. But they want them docile, terrorized, non-union, and at the service of the bosses at their discretion. And when they need to fill up some of the privatized prisons, well, the government says we save money by using privatized because private industry is more efficient than government. A front page article in the New York Times just came out with a long-term study, several, saying that the privatized prisons cost more than the regular prisons because they have various agencies that do the calculations. But they send them to these prisons where they're paid an additional amount. In fact, the prisons these days, if you want to go into a business, is pretty good. They're paying something like $40,000 a head. The deportation serves a lot of good reasons. Slave labor is one of them. That is, they have immigrants working in factories, they work a month, when their wages are come due, they're deported with zero pay. And the courts have upheld it. They're also nervous about immigrants because they bring with them the ideas from Latin American countries